me turn it over to George Cummings, who is a Revolutionary War historian, reenactor, and we are very grateful that you took the trip from your home in the Binghamton area to share all of this wonderful stuff.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you myself for being here. This is certainly one of my pleasures to talk about all of this. So all of you, when I say to you April 19th, you're all going to light up and say, yes, we remember that day very succinctly because that was the start, the battles of Lexington and Concord. 1775, so last year was the start of the 250th. This year is the big dog on the block because of the independence on July 4th. Lots of things going on. But let's talk about the beginning of the war, because I am not representing a rabble in arms, which was what the British called us back in those days, because you have to think about it. We were a colony. We were not a military power of any sort. We had no real aspects of military except for the French and Indian War. And I know you all know about the French and Indian War, but let me refresh your memory a little bit. 1754 to 1760 here in America, and your best buddy, G.W., George Washington, actually tripped that off in the Battle of Fort Necessity. And I know that you remember that also. But there were roughly 50,000 of us guys that fought with the British as provincial colonial troops. So we were very much a part of that victory. Now, you know and I know potentially that the French could have cared less about the 13 colonies. The French were more interested in the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi River. That's why they go all the way down to New Orleans. I often tell the story, why New Orleans? Well, think about it. What do we know about the St. Lawrence Seaway for a handful of months? It freezes over. How are the French going to get supplied? They got supplied through New Orleans. Problem was they had to come up the Mississippi to the Great Lakes, through the Great Lakes to Montreal and Quebec. Well, guess what? They find an easier way to do that coming across the Ohio to what we know today as Pittsburgh, which was unfortunately right within the domain of the English, who said in 1609, we own it all, except for Florida, Spanish. Okay, so again, 50,000 of us, but this is 15 years prior to 1775. So essentially, we're done. We're not necessarily thinking in terms of military activity. However, I will share with you that one of the things that's true in America at the time was that we are feeding and protecting our family. So I've brought today one of the guns that I have here, and that's this gem. We know it's American for one simple reason, that it's made out of tiger maple. That's that pretty colored wood. Tiger maple only exists in America. It does not exist in Europe. So this is a gun that is a rough copy of this British gun up top, the British Brown Bess. And so this was made by a local gunsmith. At the time of the American Revolution, there were 2,500 gunsmiths working in America. Again, why? Because we are feeding and protecting our families, especially here in New York State. What do we know about New York State? We have a very strong Indian presence, Native American presence in New York State, the Iroquois Nation, and again, allied with the British. Okay, so why am I dressed like this? Well, I'm going to fast forward you a bunch of years to 1777. What do we know about 1777? We New Yorkers should keep this very much in our focus because a very significant activity took place just north of Albany, and that is the Battle of Saratoga. September, October of 1777. Again, let's think about this for a minute. I brought this map, and it may be a long ways for some of you to see, so you can imagine it. But what do we know about New York State from the St. Lawrence Seaway all the way down to Manhattan is water. We've got the Richelieu River feeds, actually we have Lake George that's higher than Champlain. Lake George feeds into Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain feeds into the Richelieu River, which feeds into the St. Lawrence Seaway. On the west side of that is the Hudson River that flows all the way down. So in 1777, the British concluded that if they could take New York State, and again, think about New York State. It's only the eastern part of New York State. The middle part of New York State is Indian country, Iroquois country. So we're talking just the eastern border. So the whole plan of attack by the British in 1777 was to attack Albany in 3 directions. So a British general by the name of St. Leger goes down the St. Lawrence into Lake Ontario, and he comes across trying to take the Fort Oswego. Unfortunately for him, he's defeated essentially there, the Battle of Oriskany Falls. Wonderful site if you ever want to take a look at another Revolutionary War site. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, maybe you remember that name, he comes down through the lakes. He gets to the southern end of Champlain, and guess what? He is successful in taking Fort Ticonderoga. Remember, the Green Mountain Boys of Vermont took Fort Ticonderoga in 1775, and they pulled all the cannon, and Henry Knox brings all the cannon from the fort down along the Hudson to Albany, which was known as Fort Orange at the time, through the Berkshire Mountains to deliver to Washington. By the way, an interesting little story about that. He's got X number of cannon. One of the cannon drops through the ice right there in the Hudson adjacent to Albany. Now, this is the middle of winter. I'm going to look at my teammate and say, oh, well, George doesn't, if we don't tell George we lost one, then he's not going to be upset at us. Would you believe they go through the ice and bring that cannon up? They wanted to deliver to Washington the full complement of cannons. So, interesting little story. By the way, if you go down into the Berkshires, Great Barrington, for example, there are some signs there showing you the route that Knox took through that neck of the Berkshires to get to Boston. So again, he comes down, Burgoyne comes down, and if you've been to Ticonderoga, and I'll put a little shout out for Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga is very unique in that it is privately owned. It is not government owned, so for all of us that have our thoughts about Washington these days, we don't have to worry about any impact on that particular historic site because it is privately held. And it is a wonderful location. If you haven't been there in a bunch of years, please go. They've revamped it. They've put a lot of money into it. The museum is absolutely fantastic. But what happens is the British get there. They realize it's going to be quite a challenge to take it. So they actually send engineers and soldiers up a hill that is just south of it. And the Americans wake up one morning, look out, and there are the British cannon on this hill looking down on them. So sure enough, they have to scoot. They scoot across the southern end of Champlain into Vermont. They actually fight a rearguard action in the town of Hubbardton, Vermont, against the British. The British from there continue south, but again, they are frustrated and defeated by Gates, not Washington. Washington is south, but he's defeated by the Army of the North, led by Benedict Arnold, it's a name we all know, and Gates, and the Battle of Saratoga. Now, why is that important? Because it is, a lot of people say it's the turning point of the war, because that victory, when the word gets to Europe, the French decide that, hey, the Americans, rabble in arms, may have half a chance of defeating the British. So they declare war on their old-time enemy, the British. Now we're getting all sorts of goods from France, which makes a big difference, including their navy, military goods, money, everything that it is needed. So I'm standing in front of you as a soldier in 1778, and I'll share a little bit more about that. First of all, let's talk about the hat. We all know the tricorn hat, tri-corner, three corners. This is actually cut for military use, because when I'm ordered to present arms, bringing the gun to the center position, if I had a civilian tricorn, I would more than likely knock it off my head, because this front would have extended more so than the military cut. So again, the military cut. This particular decoration here, called a cockade, you notice that it's white and black. Before the French declare war on the British, it is black, just like the British one. And the French was white. So once they declared war on Britain, George Washington sent orders to the army for all of us to change out this cockade to what's known as the Alliance cockade, the white and the black, to show our alliance with France against the British. Now, again, when I'm in front of young people, I like to talk about chores. Chores. Not so sure how many young people know the word chores at this point, but that's okay. I grew up knowing chores. And so let's talk about you ladies for a second. You lovely ladies, if it wasn't for you, none of this would exist. You were expected to birth 6 to 12 kids back in those days. Why? Well, first of all, because child mortality, but also because you needed a workforce. As a matter of fact, King George, who's the third, who is now who we are fighting against, his Austrian bride gave birth to 14 kids. Okay, so in the morning, there were chores. And as I've said to a few of you earlier, you were expected to take care of those chores. So if it's raining out in the middle of winter, and remember, many of you remember what winter used to be like. Now, we had a little bit more of a winter this year, but I remember real winters. And so go back 250 years and imagine what winters were like. So again, these flaps would drop down, and if you look at this width right here, imagine that the whole hat is that width. You know, one of the things I share with kids is no such thing as hoods/umbrellas like we have today. So if you were expected to head down to the local stream, river, pond, or whatever the case may be for water, Mom, it's raining out, I don't think so. No, that's not how it went. Or you needed to go and get extra firewood. You know, whatever the case may be, Dad needed the boys to go hunting because you're getting low on game. Whatever the case may be, you would drop down the flaps, and it would give you good protection. So what are these hats made out of? Well, today they're made out of synthetic felt, because we've developed that. Back in those days, they were made out of beaver pelts. And if you study New York State, along with a number of other states, but New York State's quite much in the forefront of this, beaver trapping was a significant industry by the Europeans. The Dutch started it. Remember, the Dutch arrived 1607, the Hudson River. They come up to Fort Orange. The Dutch are trading with the Indians for pelts because Europe is denuded of all of this. Remember, Europe has been around for a long time by 1607. So what does Europe need? Europe needs what you and I have. They need the lumber. They need the tar. They need the various animal skins, any and everyone. But beaver is one of the top priorities because it's waterproof. It's a very interesting process to create felt using beaver pelt, but it would become waterproof. As a matter of fact, if you look at an old painting of Peter Stuyvesant, for example, big flowing hat, American beaver, more than likely. Because again, the Dutch were trading with the Indians from the Mohawk, the Adirondacks, the green and white mountains of Vermont and New Hampshire, and all of that was being shipped across to be produced in Europe. And so again, very significant part of the deal. Okay, so that's the hat. So the regimental coat. If I was lucky, I got one of these a year. Hopefully I got it in the fall, before winter. If I got it in the spring, by the time fall, winter came along, it was shreds. But it provided all sorts of material to patch my pants and so on and so forth. So again, raveling arms was the term that the British gave. Now, again, this is made in Europe, made in France for us. Because again, what manufacturing do we have in here? You lovely ladies, homespun. Teaching your daughters about homespun. So my shirt and other items of clothing might come from the home, but otherwise, this kind of thing needed to come from manufacturing process, which didn't exist enough in America at the time. France. So what Washington did, he sent the requests to France to color code the uniform. So all of the uniforms were the blue, the major blue part. The facings, the red part here, were determined based on state. So if you were from one of the New England states, Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, it was white on blue. New York and New Jersey were buff on blue, a lighter brown, as you know. Pennsylvania, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland were red on blue. The Carolinas and Georgia were blue on blue with gold buttons instead of silver buttons. So you say, okay, well, George, that's all well and good. You're in New York State. Why are you in red and blue? Simply because I am representing a soldier from the state of Delaware, little state of Delaware, which originally started off as the 3 lower counties of New Jersey, but ultimately got its statehood. And they sent one and only one regiment to fight with Washington, and they fought in more engagements than any other regiment from any other state. So I like to put my hats off to them for their dedication to your and my freedom. Okay, so I have a vest or a waistcoat, what was called back in those days. Again, as a proper gentleman, I would wear a hat and I would have a waistcoat. My pants are German drilling. And you can Google that if you want a little bit more information, but it is a stronger material, linen, thicker linen, heavy duty. You see my gaiters. I have gaiters on because it's that time of the year. But also think about it. Come summer, what do we know about trails? We have a lot of brush. We have a lot of briars. And if I don't have protection of this nature, it's going to rip up my pants. And then I've got the famous shoes with the big buckle. You all probably have seen pictures of that. What's critical about the shoes is there was no such thing as left foot, right foot back in those days. Because think about it, leather's expensive. It's not like we can jump on Amazon and order a new pair of shoes kind of deal. So if you wore a hole in your shoe, you're off to the cobbler to get it fixed. You're not throwing that away and saying, oh, it's time for a new pair. You didn't. And so it's very, very common that we just didn't have left foot, right foot. Now, you might start thinking in terms of, okay, this is the shoe I put on the left and this is the shoe I put on the right. It's interesting, it's not until the Civil War that we really begin to develop the left foot, right foot. And a lot of that's driven by the cavalry with their big boots needing a different fit than the average soldier. Okay, as far as my kit goes, I have my canteen. This happens to be a British tin canteen that I just acquired along the way. Otherwise, I might have my favorite Daniel Boone Davy Crockett style canteen. Very, very typical oak pieces here. And then the willow, we know that if you take willow and soak it long enough, it'll become very pliable. So the outer pieces were made out of willow, and then the inside is oak. Leaked like a sieve at first. Once you filled it with water and let it swell, then you were good to go. It's interesting though, water back in those days was not very good. And so it was not uncommon for the military to have what we would call alcohol available. Rum was very, very much a part of the deal. If you grew up along the Hudson River in a Dutch family back in the day, it was very common that at breakfast you would have beer. Why? Because it's processed. And that processing was part of what would purify it. Otherwise, you would think the water would have been as pure as could be back in those early days. But interestingly, it still wasn't. Okay, so that's the canteen. This is my haversack. When I'm in the school, I often look at the kids and say, now you've all got your backpacks or whatever. The difference is I don't have any homework in here or a laptop or an Apple phone or anything of that nature. Very simply, I would have had a few days worth of rations, salted pork or beef jerky, something of that nature. I would have hand whittled a little bowl like this for porridge or soup or something of that nature. And then I would have had a deer skin wrapped up with my utensils, a bone spoon, which again I would have whittled, and then a fork. Now, forks are a little different. Obviously, this is what you flip a steak in the middle of summer on the grill with today. Back in those days, it was interesting because this was not that common. Why? Because this is not easily made, number one. It had to be produced, and so the soldiers didn't necessarily all have that. But what was common back in those days was what you and I might call a butter knife, big butter knife, but a knife like this, because as good Europeans, which most of us were, we were in a process of eating with bread, which was a standard diet back in those days, producing bread and getting it to the military. But you more than likely would have had a piece of bread in one hand, you would have cut whatever it was you were eating and then scoop it with that bulbous end. So again, the fork was not a necessary utensil as it might be today, because we don't go around cutting and using our knife to feed ourselves. But back in those days, it was common to do that. On this side, I've got the cartridge box. Very, very important. Matter of fact, George Washington wrote 3 different orders about how these were to be produced. And generally speaking, it is nothing but a wood block drilled out for the size of the bore of my musket. Now, most of the muskets at that particular time, the British had the .75, roughly 3/4 of an inch. The British were either .67 or .69, a little bit smaller. If I were a rifleman, it could have been even smaller, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 thousandths to maybe ½ an inch. But again, I knew exactly what size I needed for my musket, so I would drill it out and then simply wrapped in leather. And now, most of these would have 2 flaps, because again, we are not fighting in pouring rain. We are not fighting in a hurricane. We are not fighting in very heavy, muggy weather because of its spoilage to the powder. And so it was imperative to keep the powder dry. Keep your powder dry. You remember that famous statement. Then the other little gems that I have is what we call a pick and brush. And let's talk about that for a second. So when we look at these firearms, we all recognize this more than likely as the flintlock system of ignition. So this came about in early 1600s. Again, the French came up with this idea. And you basically have a stone, a piece of flint, and it is harder than steel. So the combination, and by the way, this is how you would start a fire. You're just going to scrape a piece of flint against a piece of iron or vice versa to create the sparks. So it was basically that system. So here you have a gun typical of the period, and you put it into what's known as the half-cocked position. There is no way I can fire this gun. This is now in the safety position. And then I reach into my cartridge box, and I'm going to pull out what looks like this right here. And this is a great example of recycle. At the time of the American Revolution, they were recycling newspapers. Why? Because Benjamin Franklin and his printing press, we have all sorts of newspapers in New York and Philadelphia, other towns, and sure enough, Albany, New York, and Springfield, Massachusetts, were various arsenals that were making cartridges for the Army at this time. So, now to load this. To become a soldier with George Washington's Continental Army, I was between the ages of 16 to 60. But more importantly, I needed to have at least 2 opposing teeth in my mouth, because the requirement to get paid $6.35 a month fighting with Washington was that I had to be able to rip this cartridge open, this paper open with my teeth. If I didn't have the right setup of teeth or any teeth at all, then I would have to rest the musket and pull out a knife or something of that nature. And by the time I did all of that, my company would have fired 3-4 times, or the British would have stabbed me with a bayonet by then. So, therefore, 16 to 60, 2 opposing teeth, and so now I'm going to rip this open, exposing the powder, and I'm going to prime the pan. I'm going to put a little amount of powder in there and close the frizzen. The remainder, I'm going to pour the powder first into the muzzle, and then the paper and the ball, 1 ounce. You can come on up, there's some 1 ounce balls up here. And then I'm going to carefully remove the ramrod, and I'm going to push all that down and seat it in the breech. Get it down, pack it down. The more I pack it, although I can't sit there pushing on it for 2 minutes, but I want to give it a couple of good packs, because that's going to help the compression and give me a little bit better distance. And oh, by the way, worst come to worst, if they were really under pressure, another way they did it was simply to slam the gun butt down first. That would seat all of that, rather than the time it took to remove the ramrod. Okay, once I've done that, I'm now ready to go. So I have the gun fully primed, loaded in the half-cock position. So again, I'm given the order to present arms. I bring the gun to this position. You're then given the order to cock your firelock. And so now I'm going to pull the hammer back into its firing position. Don't worry, I'm not going to pull the trigger and shoot it. And now I'm going to aim your firelock and boom, pull the trigger. And if all goes well, powder's dry. And what's important is there's a little touch hole between the pan and the breech. And that's what this little pick is all about. If I have that little vent hole is plugged, I get what's known as a flash in the pan. One of those many statements from, again, go off half-cock from the American Revolution. Interestingly, powder back in those days was not very good. So therefore, every 3rd or 4th shot, only about 50, maybe 60% of the powder would actually explode to send the ball. The rest would be like black sludge. So all of you that have stoves at home or gas fireplaces, whatever, you notice that black soot that collects on the stones and whatnot. That's collecting on this gun. Again, I have to keep that vent open, and the brush is just there to help me brush away any of that extra soot. Because again, I have to load and fire this gun to be paid $6.35 a month. I've got to be able to shoot this gun 3 to 4 times a minute, every 15 seconds, to be a Continental soldier dressed as I am in front of you fine folks today. So, it took a bit of work and a bit of training, but again, that is the breakdown of basically the outfit that you see me with today. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit more about some of life as a Continental soldier. We've talked about some things, but I brought some toys up here for you to take a look at, and I'll go through them now. And so we'll start over here. Again, one of the things that you, as a young person, family member, had to do. Think about this for a minute. Between candles and firewood to get through a winter in New York State was a fair amount of activity. You think about that, how much firewood it took. And by the way, a house back in those days, middle of winter, maybe 50 degrees inside, 55, somewhere in that neighborhood, depending upon how big your hearth was and how often you stoked it. So life was a little bit different. But let's talk about candles. candles came in a lot of different forms. A lot of candles were made out of animal fat. If you were lucky, you had some beeswax. But yeah, it was just, but as I often say to people, the good news was we all smelled the same. So there was not really a lot of difference there. If you lived in the New England area, you might have cranberries available, and you could actually add them to your candle makeup that would give a little bit more fragrance. But I brought you this is a very early flashlight. It's made out of tin, which back in the day was made by what we call a whitesmith. Today we call him a tinsmith. Back in those days it was a whitesmith. Why? Because tin in its original form was quite bright, not white, but quite bright. And a silversmith worked on silver, so they couldn't call him a silversmith. They had to differentiate. But this is just a very simple, you see the candle. In the morning, I simply fold the candle in, close it up, and now this just goes into my haversack and good for that night. Along with that, I might have a couple of these gems, especially the officer, because at the end of the day, we know that the officer has to fill out some information. Who's available, who's in sick bay, how much ammunition you have, so on and so forth. And so the officer would have these candlesticks, and sure enough, in the morning, he'd simply take them apart like that and put that on top of that, and he'd screw that together and put that in his knapsack and ready for the next evening. So again, officers were required to do that kind of work. I brought this little gem, guys, pretty important. This is an officer's one, but this is for shaving. So we would shave into this. I don't know why it was particular to keep the shavings, but apparently it was. But the other side of this was a bleeding bowl. Back in those days, bleeding people with a disease that had a disease was one of the ways. They thought that the disease was transmitted by blood. And so, by the way, that's how we lost GW in 1799. He goes out riding before dinner, gets wet, and instead of changing his clothes, he sits down for dinner. That night, he wakes up in the middle of the night with a bad throat, and sure enough, a couple of days later, he dies. They bled him, which just weakened him to a point where he did not survive. So this would go up against your arm or up against your thigh and collect the blood when they would bleed you. Again, officer, because of how nice it is. Speaking of officers, I brought this little gem to show you. This is the last remaining piece of the days of armor. This would have been the neck protector. Now, not necessarily for the American Army, because GW did not have this for officers. This was the European officers, your British, your French, your Hessian, German, Spanish, those officers, Dutch, would typically wear this, and it was the mark of an officer. And this is stamped, you can come on up and take a look at it. It's stamped with the British crown. But what's interesting, in a number of museums, there are these that are stamped US. So we do know that some of Washington's officers who captured these would stamp them US and actually wear them. So we do have evidence that they did exist for some of the American officers. Ladies, that's as good as it gets, but that's your shears. Believe it or not, they still work, but that's an 18th century pair of shears that you're going to use to make those wonderful outfits for that husband that's out in the field. Ladies, you might look at this and say, well, I seem to recall that does look a little familiar, but it's not for you ladies, it's for us men. This is a wig curler. Why? Well, because, again, we did not have shampoo back then. And soap was made out of lye and animal fat, or animal fat. So, therefore, hair products didn't exist, which is another reason why we men wore a hat and you lovely ladies all wore bonnets. It was the hair condition. But because of that, many men, especially officers, would shave their heads or cut their hair very short, and they would wear a wig. And so it was expected, if you were wearing a wig, that it was to be curled properly before you were seen in front of the troops. And so again, a very, very simple 18th century wig curler. Another tinsmith, a little cup. I could have had a bone cup, a wood cup, a tin cup, lots of different cups for water back in the days. This is an interesting story. This was actually the metal rim of a barrel. We never threw anything away back in those days. So when that barrel was emptied of its contents, the wood staves would become firewood, but the metal we would then twist like this, and we would put that in the coals and your pot on top of it, because the pot is more expensive. And we're trying to not burn through the bottom of that brass pot any sooner than we have to. So this is just a broiler kind of device, and so very typical of using everything we had. Following suit with that, we might have the local blacksmith make one of these for us, which serves the same purpose. The difference is, in the morning after breakfast, we're going to wipe this off and we're going to fold it right up like that, and we're going to stick it in our haversack, and it's good for that evening when we're back cooking again. Powder horns, you know that these were popular. Again, just a cattle horn. And what they did was, and we have a professional horn maker right here in front, sitting here, John, very, very famous. You can talk to him later. He makes these wonderfully. But they would have soaked these in water to soften them up. And then with their knife, they would have scraped them to thin them down a little bit so that they could see how much powder was in them. But then also, they would scrimshaw them. They would do all sorts of designs with their knives. And some of these powder horns, a lot of them are maps showing the various routes that these soldiers fought. And again, if you get to Ticonderoga has one of the best collections of original French and Indian War powder horns. It's just an incredible collection. But again, your riflemen, which I'm not portraying specifically today, this would have been an example of one of the rifles, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But he would have known exactly how much powder, and he would have had a little powder measure of some sort. 40 grains, 50, 60, 70 grains. But he would have known exactly how to do that. And then these are what he would also use, because when we came to making the balls, because remember, it is not until just before the Civil War that the French developed what we know as the mini ball, which is conical. Minet is the Frenchman. Up until that point, it's all round ball, 1 ounce round ball. So that's being poured into a mold using lead. When you extract it, you've got to take off the upper edge of it, the sprue, what we call the sprue, and so you've got scissors like this that would have cut that. How did we stay warm in the winter? Not easy, but we typically would have a homespun linen blanket like this. Again, mom, thank you, wife, thank you, daughter, sisters, whatever the case may be. But very typical of the early style of linen blankets that would have been out there. And then, ladies, these next two items are for you, front and center. So, George Washington wrote 25 orders regarding women and what you would do for the Army. And believe me, without you, the Army didn't go very far. Remember that George Washington, fighting as an officer, colonial officer with the British during the French and Indian War, learns a lot of how the British Army works. Again, the British Army been around for a while. So he learns a lot of that process, which leads him to a better position with the American Army. One of them is the enlistment, the use of women. And again, 25 orders regarding where you would march, how many women would be involved, and more importantly, some of your chores, tasks that you would actually be paid for. So a lot of you women would be paid for taking care of officers' uniforms. So imagine for a minute you've got a wicker basket of some sort. You've got some of your clothes, you've got your husband's clothes, you get some clothes from some of the officers within your husband's company, and off to the stream, creek, river, spring, whatever the case may be, along with this gem and that bar of soap made out of lye. And you're going to scrape the sweat out of those clothes as best as you can in the water. And then you're going to bring the clothes back to camp, and the officer's uniform is going to need to be ironed. So you've got this god-awful thing, and it is just that. It's just a chunk of iron. It's called a sad iron, and the word sad just stands for heavy. Heavy iron. Sorry, ladies, no steam button on these bad boys. And sure enough, you'd stick this in the fire, you'd let it get nice and warm, you'd get a stick to pull it out, wrap the handle with cloth, and you would iron as best as you could without putting a nice big hole in the uniform, and life was good back then. Today we don't use them as much as we used to, but a lot of us grew up with Brillo pads. Well, this is an 18th century Brillo pad. You basically just have a chunk of straw or hay, you wrap it around a piece of metal or a stick or whatever, and you then tie it up and take that little hatchet and you hatch it, and you would just use this to scrape the fry pan, scrape off the burnt food easily enough. Lasts for a while, and then time to get a new one. Camp stoves, again, we're not always cooking on open fires, especially if the weather is bad. So I brought you, these are actually period camp stoves. Interesting because you can see the kind of heart motif that this particular blacksmith used. But again, you're in a tent or a small cabin, Valley Forge, whatever, for example, and you're going to just put the coals in here, put your pot on top, and warm up that stew or whatever you've got. And then another example right here. This is quite fragile, so I don't take it apart, but you're basically going to lift this grill up to put the coals in there, and then the pot would sit on the four, one's missing, 250 years old. You put the pot on top, and again, the coals are going to drop down onto this piece here, so you're protecting whatever might be underneath there. If you've got a blanket or a tarp of some sort down there, and these legs will keep it somewhat elevated, so hopefully it doesn't start a fire of some sort. Okay, now let's talk about these gems. So the examples that I brought to you fine folks today, the top one is the British Brown Bess. The Brown Bess was developed sometime around 1720, 1725. The reason it was developed is because back in those days, the British Army, which was the largest army in the world, they would simply have somebody who was willing to pay the government to become a colonel. So if you came from a military family, it was understood that sure enough you would buy your commission, you would become a colonel, and the government would ultimately give you money to then arm your regiment. Well, what you would do is instead of contracting the local gunsmiths or the local gun makers, you'd go to the continent, the Netherlands, France, or whatever, and you would buy substandard guns and you would pocket the difference. Well, the government woke up one day and said, that's the end of that. So that's when they began to develop their own system. And so basically what they did was they went to the Birmingham, all you that have traveled to England, the city of Birmingham was the heart of the gun manufacturing. They went to those guys and they said, okay, we want to make a gun that we're going to adopt, approve, standardize, and they did that. There it is right there. It started off initially with a 46-inch barrel. After the French and Indian War, both the British and the French redesigned their weapons because what used to work in Europe didn't work in America for one simple reason. Europe was denuded of its forests, so they could have big battles, big armies, cavalry, light cavalry, heavy cavalry, artillery, so on and so forth. The British arrive in America, and what do we have? forests. So all of a sudden, the realization that these big, long guns just weren't going to work. So sure enough, the British, after the French and Indian War, redesigned their gun, and they go from 46 inches to 42 inches. Not that big of a deal. Ultimately, they end up at 39 inches. That's a different story. So you're basically looking at what's known as the second model Brown Bess, or the short land service musket. And again, very standard 75 caliber, heavy ball, accurate only to 70, maybe 100 yards, not beyond that. The key to the soft bore, smooth bore, was how quickly it could be loaded and fired. And again, 3 to 4 minutes was the training. But as importantly, and this is not a sight that you see up front there, that is the lug to lock the bayonet. Because the way that they fought in Europe, not in America, but in Europe, was that the two armies would come onto the field about 50, 60 yards apart. Think about a soccer field or a football field, half that distance. Flags flying, drums beating, officers screaming, officers on big white horses, the whole 9 yards. By the way, in Europe, you never shot the officers. It was illegal, in effect, to shoot the officers. Why? Because without the officers, the soldiers would fall into chaos. And that was unacceptable in 18th century warfare in Europe. Not in America, in Europe. They come onto the field, they would actually discuss who would shoot first. They would come to an agreement on who would shoot first. And then they'd bang away at each other, maybe only once or twice, and then they would level the muskets with the bayonets, and at a quick step, it would be called give them the steel, give them the bayonet. That would determine the battle. Interestingly, when the British come to America, you've got a guy by the name of Daniel Morgan. He's a backwoodsman, and he is in charge of, he basically helps Washington by bringing to Washington riflemen who can hit a target at 200 to 300 yards. And by the way, they're backwoodsmen. They don't understand anything about killing officers. They could care less. As a matter of fact, an officer on a big white horse, love it. Love it. I'm going to get credit for that. So guess what? The British complained. They sent letters to Washington. You cannot shoot our officers. Ultimately, by the time of the war that I'm now representing, if a British officer got orders to leave Britain for America, he was expected to go to London and settle his affairs, because his life expectancy in America was less than a half a year because of the American riflemen. And oh, by the way, you say to me, well, why didn't Washington's army be made up totally of riflemen that can hit a target at 200 yards? Very simple. It takes a minute plus to load this. These guys are, again, 3 to 4 times a minute. Essentially, what we were forming, shoulder to shoulder, was a shotgun. We loaded together, we aimed together, we fired together. We didn't even see if we hit anything. Why? Because the speed of loading these guys required that the ball was lower, smaller diameter than the inside of the barrel. So what that meant was when I pulled that trigger, that ball was bouncing its way down the barrel. And the part of the barrel that it last touched, it would send it the other way. So I may be aiming at somebody at the top of those stairs and somebody over there drops dead. I had no idea. Partially also because, again, I have a sergeant or a captain with a long spittoon spear that's going to whap me on the head if I don't immediately start reloading the musket as soon as I pull that trigger. I can't stand there and admire, whoa, look at that. Boom. 3 to 4 times a minute I'm required to go at it. Okay, now, again, 1777, 1778, the British declare war. Prior to that, Benjamin Franklin and several other Americans are over, in the court of Louis XVI negotiating for goods. One of the things that they heavily negotiate for and are very successful are muskets. So, the French normally named their muskets by the year that they were developed. So after the French and Indian War, the French immediately redeveloped. They come up with the model 1763. They changed it a little bit to the 1765. They changed it a little bit to the 1768. Then they came out with the 1772. Then they came out with the 1777. I share all that with you because the arsenals in France were full of what they called, or what we term today as the model 1763/68. And that's what this is. This is the original musket of that. And we know that because this musket, you can come on up later, is marked, stamped US. It is stamped United States, U States right here, which was typical. It's stamped US on the back side here and on the butt tag. So this is an actual gun, 1777 period, 1778, shipped to America. 30,000 of these are ultimately sold/given to Americans. So now Washington has an army that has a relatively standard weapon. Prior to that, many of his soldiers have, again, either captured British Brown Besses or they've got guns made by a local gunsmith that, again, is roughly the similar caliber. And then this gun, a little odd looking, is a Dutch musket. So we all know that in 1776, when the British come back to America to re-engage Washington after leaving Boston in March of 1776, the British bring back 10,000 Hessian troops. Now again, I can't use the word Germans because there's no such thing as Germany. There were all sorts of various groups that made up Germany as we know it, famously called the Hessians, although there was a number of different groups that made them up. But this was very typical of the military gun that they brought back. Again, it's a Dutch style. We call it a Dutch style, but also very common of what was made in Germany at that time. Again, very similar. It worked the same way, same general caliber. Buttstock is cut a little differently, but again, just the way that they developed their guns. So again, now also American troops, if you found one of those that was serviceable versus what you had, you dropped what you had in favor of one of those. You know, again, you did whatever you could to stay ahead of the game. So I've gone through all those pieces of excitement and everything up here. I'll turn it over to any questions at this moment. Yes?
You said that each person who fought in the army was paid $6.35. Where'd the money come from?
That's a good question. It didn't. It didn't. So let's talk about currency, because even today currency is an exciting thing. So you remember, because you've read this, that the states were generating their own paper currency, okay? How was it backed? It was backed strictly more on the barter basis than anything else. It wasn't like there were gold reserves or whatever. More importantly, what they call specie, which is coin, would have been more common. So you've got Spanish milled dollars was very, very dominant. And by the way, it's very true that those Spanish milled dollars were cut in quarters, and that's where the quarters came from. I'll be with you just a second. So, but part of the problem was that when the British came to Lower Manhattan Bay in June, July of 1776, they flooded the market with counterfeit currency, which just totally, you talk about inflation today, you know, it was just incredible inflation back in those days. But essentially, we weren't living by currency back in those days. We were living by barter and or what we could produce ourselves kind of thing. And so the currency really just never had the backing. No such thing as Federal Reserve, setting interest rates, so on and so forth. So yes, it was really crazy. So, for example, I think the Battle of Trenton, many of you probably heard about that. That was Christmas of 1776. Again, Washington gets totally defeated in and around Manhattan, New York City, gets pushed all the way across New Jersey, collects all the boats on the Delaware, puts them on the lower side, Pennsylvania side of the river, and realizes that his army is going to go home. As of December 31st, his army is done. Their enlistments are up. And by the way, your Continental Congress never allowed Washington initially to enlist an army for the duration of the war. It was 6-month or 1-year enlistments. Why? Because your Continental Congress was afraid of Washington winning the war and then proclaiming himself king. So they didn't let him. So he is faced with his soldiers, his army going home in December of 1776, which is why he comes up with the plan to attack the Hessian units that are in Trenton. But it's interesting because he sends several of his emissaries to Philadelphia to collect as much hard currency as he can. And that's what he uses to pay the soldiers that have agreed to stay with him for just 3 more months. He knew that trying to pay them with paper. Now, as you all know, a lot of soldiers were reimbursed with land or land purchasing opportunities and so on and so forth. But again, the soldiers weren't there necessarily for pay, because you were going to go broke. You were there because of being patriot, because you wanted to get out from underneath the British rule, taxation without representation, all those wonderful things. So, did you have a question?
So, how did Washington know how he would become a president? How does he know about president?
Well, he doesn't. That's a good question. He never knew that at all. Matter of fact, he didn't necessarily seek that. George Washington was always a military person. He always was oriented to the military. He just happened to be the most recognizable person at the time, and rather than call him king, which was a European thing, they wanted to establish a democracy as best as possible, and they needed a leader, because every organization, country should have a leader. So he became the president, but that was not his intention, and at the time of the war, nobody thought about who was going to ultimately be in charge, just because we didn't know if we were going to win the war or not. So, but good question. Yes, sir.
Never mind. I thought of a question I just forgot.
Yes, sir.
How do the militias get their weapons and did they get paid?
No, there was no pay for the militia. So let's talk about it. So here we are in Cortland, Ithaca, Homer, which, by the way, none of these places were habitated at the time. But let's just say we're in Homer, and there's 10 of us that are good patriots. So once a month, we're going to bring out our hunting guns, because again, we're living in the frontier. We're feeding our family and protecting our family. So we're going to get together, and we're dressed just as all of you are today. None of this, unless you fought as a provincial during the French and Indian War. You might still have some military gear left, but that's 15 years ago. Did it last? Maybe, maybe not. And so you come to the town square in downtown Homer, and you would parade around a little bit, and the kids would come out and laugh and throw stones, and the wives would walk by and be proud as could be. But again, once a month, you would do that. Now, when did you get called up? You only got called up when the enemy was within a certain distance, was typically the method that they used, the militia. Now, you know that there are a number of battles of the American Revolution where the militia was front and center. Certainly, the Minutemen is a great example of the militia. And they harassed the British terribly after the Battle of Concord when they were heading back, and tremendous casualties. Again, the militia was essentially what was on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill on June 17th of 1775. Again, no formal army at that point. And Washington hadn't arrived till July, early July. So again, example of militia. So in different parts of the country, militia were stronger and more active, more organized than other areas. But no, there was no pay for them. Now the third level of service would be what they called state levies. So again, the formal army was the Continental Army, paid, dressed like this. Then, if you wanted to still serve, but there was reasons why you couldn't be in that, you could potentially be within a state levy. Or if you were strictly local and you were part of the militia, all well and good. So those are really the three levels of service. So, how about the first one?
How big were the battlefields?
Well, it depended on the size of the armies. Now, back in those days, these were not very, very large battles. Generally, 2,000, maybe 3,000 soldiers on each side against each other. And again, it depends on the location. You know, some of these battles were relatively small and some of them were larger. Just tremendous variety of size. If you've been to Gettysburg, for example, which was 3 days worth of fighting, you had the Confederates had 75,000 troops, the Union had 110,000 troops. Huge compared to anything that the American Revolution ever. So, and by the way, most of the casualties, and I know you know this, most of the casualties were disease and exposure, not from wounds of these wonderful pieces. I got one guy before you. Yes, sir.
What weapon did George Washington have?
Well, George Washington had two weapons. He had a sword, and then he had what they call a brace of pistols, which is two pistols. And they would have been in a saddle holsters. So imagine him sitting on a horse, and in front of him was this a pistol holster setup with two pistols inside. But he was always protected. He had what was called a life guard. And so he had Virginia cavalry that were always surrounding him, always his protection to make sure nothing happened to him. So, yes?
What was your rank?
I'm as low as they get. I'm a dog soldier. I'm in the trenches. I'm in a foxhole somewhere.
Okay, I wasn't sure if your rank on the hat
No.
was designated the two weapons.
You're talking about these right here?
Yes.
No, that's where I would have put my pipe. So if you look at pictures of Vietnam, the soldiers had their cigarettes or whatever up there. Well, in Washington's case, they would have slid a pipe up in there, or a fig leaf, which was again one of the ways that they denoted, because remember the British, up until the point of the Alliance Cockade, the British hats with a black cockade would have been almost identical. You know, a tricorn hat is a tricorn hat. I don't care how you shake it, which is why a lot of times the British units actually, and American units, actually adopted different headgear, was to change that. And initially, before this all arrived, a lot of the American regimental coats were captured from the British because we had naval privateers that were raiding the troop ships and the supply trips that were coming across. John Paul Jones is a name, for example, and they would capture guns and uniforms, and they would ship all that to the Army. Well, so, you know, here you got a regiment of Americans, and they receive a shipment of British regimental coats that are scarlet red. Now what? So they would typically dye them. So a lot of times when you see paintings or depictions of soldiers prior to what you see here, it's typically brown, with red facings would have been typical. Again, because brown was a color that was available that they could dye the scarlet. So, yeah. Yes? Oh, okay. Yes, sir.
I don't see any sights on that rifle. Do they have some kind of sighting system?
Well, there's sights. There's a rear sight right there.
Oh,
And a
okay.
front
I
sight.
couldn't see it from
Yeah, yeah. Or they just look down the barrel. Remember that a rifleman, up until this point, was shooting the heads off turkeys or whatever. You know, these guys really knew what they were doing. They were backwoodsmen. They were scouts, which is basically what they were for Washington. They were scouts. And so they were really very capable of just looking down that barrel. And remember, a British officer on a big white horse, he doesn't have to have very good sights to deal effectively with that. So, yes, sir.
During the winters,
Oh, yeah.
did you have a greatcoat, or is what you're wearing and a blanket in?
Whichever, whatever, anything above, whatever I could get my hands on. As a matter of fact, the Battle of Trenton, prior to that, when Washington was being pushed across New Jersey, many of us have seen stories or read, these guys were barefoot. You know, it's almost like the Confederates, Battle of Gettysburg. They turned to go into Gettysburg because they heard there were shoes there. Now that was June, July. We're talking November, December for the Battle of Trenton. But the answer is yes. Whatever you had, or whatever you could get, you did. So.
But it wasn't issued.
No. You know, again, we're talking 1776. This is only the second year of the war. War starts April 19th of 1775. By the fall of 1776, we're on our heels big time. Whatever product, whatever goods. As a matter of fact, there was a statistic that I read that after all of the various battles that took place, Long Island, New York, Manhattan, over into Fort Washington, Fort Lee, Washington lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 plus muskets were lost in that series of engagements alone. So the point was, he had little if anything, and they suffered big time, no doubt about it. So, the next time you're driving up I-88 heading to Albany, I want you to think about two things. First of all, Unadilla. Unadilla, New York, is where the British Indian Tories gathered before they began to raid the New York frontier. Little old Unadilla. And then when you go farther up, you go past Schoharie. And as you're heading up, the Schoharie River goes through there, and you go down, and then you go back up. As you're going back up, heading east, look to your right towards Middleburg, and that lovely valley in there was Washington's breadbasket. And it was attacked several times by the Indians, actually. There were 3 forts. And just there in Schoharie, there's a wonderful church. It was built out of stone in 1773, but they fortified that for the war. It was called the Upper Fort. There was one in Middleburg, one about halfway up, and then the stone church right there in Schoharie was the Upper Fort. And they were fortified with militia units. And actually, there's a battle in 1780, 1781 called the Flockery, which was the very first battle of the American cavalry. Took place there. So if you want to go for a little adventure sometime, go out to Schoharie, look up that fort. And by the way, there's a wonderful bistro before you get there with wonderful soup and homemade pies. Highly recommend it. But that fort is a museum now. They've got other buildings right there, a lovely covered bridge right there. It's a beautiful spot. So that was a breadbasket providing wheat, oats, barley, you name it. It was all grown in that valley and supplied to Washington's army. So I will say to all of you, I'm here for the day. I'm all yours. So come on up. There's nothing you can break. This stuff has been around for a while, but you're certainly welcome to come on up, take a look. If you want to heft a gun, please let me know so that I deal with that for you. But please come on up. I also brought you a map for those that might be curious. This was the Battle of Newtown and the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, a map of that. And it can show you some of the locations and some of that particular campaign against...
I'm at the Courthouse Park here today in March 7th, 2026, and I'm looking at this boulder that was erected by the Daughters of the American Revolution, DAR, 1906. It's sitting here at the Courthouse Park, but originally it was at the intersection of Clinton Ave, Elm Street, Church Street. And I've got some videos of when the St. Anthony's Day procession would march by it. This boulder then was in a lot better shape, a lot cleaner. But anyway, this will be the 250th year of our independence. And here is in memory of those patriots now buried in Cortland County who fought for the independence of their country in the War of the American Revolution, erected by the Neoga chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, 1906. Now on the back is inscribed names of all those who are interred in Cortland County. A lot of names were certainly a lot different back then. General Daniel Brown, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Emerson, Major Aaron Day, Captain Ebenezer Carley, Captain John Gillette, George Ecker, John LeBright, Hezekiah Allen, Thomas Gould Alford, Timothy Andrews, Joseph Elwood, Jonathan Babcock Sr., Solomon Baker, William Woldorf, Joshua Bassett, Zara Beebe, Darius Benjamin, Johnson Bingham, Ebenezer Blake. Maybe you'll be able to read some of these names if you pause it and try to enlarge it. That's appropriate. And there are more names down here. Captain Isaiah Michaelis. And then over here is another plaque. Daughters of the American Revolution, Revolutionary War Patriots. This marker commemorates the men and women who achieved American independence. These patriots, believing in the noble cause of liberty, fought valiantly to found a new nation from 1775 to 1783. Presented by the Neoga Daughters of the American Revolution in honor of the 250th anniversary of the United States. America 250 years, Daughters of the American Revolution. Another thing was those cannons over there.
Sorry for my dogs.
Oh, that's all right.
I'm trying to walk them and clean up the park.
Well, that's That's
Wish
very,
people wouldn't throw their garbage all over.
that's very commendable of you.
I guess. It's something to do though. Let me get out of your way.
No, you're all right.
Something to do. It's going to be really bad once it's warm and all the drug addicts come out to the park again.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, those cannons. They used to have cannonballs too. We used to like to sit on them. So anyway, like I said originally, this thing was moved from Clinton Ave to the center of the park, across from the old high school. I think at one time first they moved that DAR Revolutionary War boulder from the intersection there of Clinton Ave and Church and Elm, and I think they set it here if I'm not wrong. And then it went to where all the other memorials are. Old police car. They're going by that boulder on Clinton Ave now with that monument that's in the courthouse park. Francis DeShenza, there's that monument. That's Mike DeShenza with the cross. There's that monument, Clinton Ave. Unfortunately for humanity, mankind, it's a never-ending battle.